Welcome to Year 3 of the Funding Love podcast with Mal and Kate. We are two adoptive moms that seek to love, support, and elevate all corners of the adoption triad while running our nonprofit Funding Love.
In Year 3, we will be talking all about parenting, Disney, adoption, and more with an all-star lineup of incredible guests, both inside and outside the adoption community.
So grab your favorite beverage and pull up a chair,
because everyone has a seat at our table.
Together, we are Funding Love,
the podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Funding Love podcast. I am Kate. Of course, I'm here with Mal and our two book club guests. You know them well because they've been with us before, but we have Allison Olson and Jesse Matos back. And you guys, we're going to dive into this book that we've been reading this second quarter of the year. So Mal, intro us up. Let's get going.
Yeah, absolutely. So our book for the second quarter of the book club is You Should Be Grateful, and I'm reading it off the cover here, Stories of Race, Identity, and Transracial Adoption by Angela Tucker. And what a great read it has been. I have to say, I told Caitlin this a while back when we were discussing the book. I was like, a lot of books that you read, you kind of get through the main point by halfway, and then the last half is like just kind of a bit of redundant of them driving the narrative home.
Yes.
This book was not like that. Like the story went all the way through. She made some really great and had really great educational points all the way through. And so I thoroughly enjoyed it. So welcome back, Allison, Jesse.
Yes.
Do you guys enjoy reading the book? Just like a brief.
Yes. I love this book. This was a easy read. Like you said, it kind of captivates you like the entire time.
It does. Yeah. Oh, yeah, no doubt. I couldn't put it down. It was so good. There's so much that we have to talk about for this episode, for this book. And I hope our listeners and our viewers really did read with us. And if not, after this episode, I think you're going to want to read it because I think the conversation and the topics we're going to talk about are very intriguing. And as an adoptive mom or an adoptee or a birth mom, I think you will get something from it. It will be very eye-opening because there's a lot of perspectives that I was able to see through this time that was so good. So we have so much to talk about. Yeah.
Yes, and I just want to remind our listeners and our watchers on YouTube that we have Jessie with us, who is a birth mom, and then we also have Allison, who is an adoptee and an adoptive mom. So we're so excited to really hear your perspective and both of your perspectives on this book, as well as Caitlin and I are adoptive moms. So I say let's dive right in. And I really wanted to start off the episode by kind of addressing, it's not an elephant in the room, but I feel like it is something that we need to address. And it's the fact that this is a book written by a transracial adoptee, and we are all four white women that are raising children, and we are learning things as we read this book. So why don't we all kind of give our thoughts on the points that Angela made and something that stuck out to us and something that we learned from this book, from her experience?
Yes, I'd love to hear.
Who wants to start?
Who's got some thoughts? Well, I do feel like you were saying, I guess it does have that transracial element, but before we started recording, I think even in our email back and forth, there's so much, even in that transracial conversation, that we can take away just as adoptive moms or anybody in the adoption triad from just the conversations she's had. But one thing that stuck out to me, when she's talking about race, Angela Tucker, the author, has talks about she has like a mentorship, right? She mentors adoptees, I think adoptive parents. And she was at this event or this, I don't even know where she was in the book where she was talking about, but she has a room full of teenage boys who are transracial adoptees. And she starts the conversation. She seems to be like one of those girls. I don't know her, but one of those women who you walk in a room and she must elude this comfort, because it seems like these teenage boys, for whatever reason, just opened up to her. And I love that. But the conversation, she starts, let me see if I can find it in my book. She starts off the conversation with them to see if she can get their minds going and whatever. She talks about the term Oreo. So she is a Black woman, but she was raised by white parents as well. Okay, so she was an adoptee. She was raised by white parents. And she talks about a time as a Black woman or a Black teenager when she was growing up. She said, Talk about her that she plays basketball. She has the skills to play basketball, but she also plays piano like Beethoven. They said, "You're the whitest black person I've ever met. You're like an Oreo." And she talks about that term. She kind of just says that and then opens up the conversation for these boys. But I'm curious your guys' thoughts on that, because the next page, she kind of stops the conversation between the boys and says, "Guys, this is not a term of endearment," is what she says. And I want to kind of open up that conversation there if you guys have any thoughts on that. Because I, as a white woman, guess I never would have thought that would be maybe a triggering word. Not that I would ever use it. It's never really in my vocabulary, but that it would be something so, I guess triggering is the word. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I've heard from transracial adoptee friends and just even minority friends who grew up in a predominantly white community, they've heard that term a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like one of the things that they've talked about is how you're not black enough, but you're not white enough. And so they're kind of stuck in this in between of trying to figure out where they belong. And I hear a lot of times for transracial adoptees that it isn't until they go off to college that they really start to embrace their heritage and their culture and their race, because they've been removed from their community, the white community. And so, yeah, I guess if you've never had any other experiences with that word, you might not realize that it was maybe a little bit of a microaggression, or maybe not so much as of a microaggression, really. So I was surprised that she was that, maybe not surprised, but she was pretty
Yeah.
blunt about it with those
Mhm.
kids. Which one of the things that she talks about in the book is that they regurgitate the stories that they hear from their adoptive parents.
Yes.
And so when you're told something, obviously from a really young age, you just accept it as is and that it's totally fine. So I think that maybe has an influence in why those boys didn't really realize that it was maybe not the best thing to be called.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I absolutely loved this book.
Yeah.
Cover to cover, I've read it twice. That's how much I loved it. I'm also a big fan of Angela Tucker's. I think that first of all, I think this book is good for all folks touched by adoption or folks wanting to learn about adoption. So I think
Yeah.
it goes well beyond transracial adoptees and transracial and adoptive parents of a transracial adoptee, right?
Yes.
So for me, as a white person, I am always and will always be in learning mode, right?
Mhm.
So and the main ones that I listen to, especially in the adoption community, are adult transracial adoptees, right? Because they have been through an experience that as a white adoptee, I have not been through. So we have lots of similarities, but then we have others that are not. And so it's important to learn these terms. It's important to learn that nobody wants to be comparing their skin color to food,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Like
Right.
you're a mocha color, you're a dark ooh,
That is
Chocolate
actually
color,
true
right.
because she talks about like caramel and like
yeah.
Yep.
those like levels of darkness, right? Like that's
Mhm.
Yeah, and so I think again going back to like the purpose of this podcast and thinking about education within the adoption community and recognizing my own whiteness and white privilege is knowing these things, keeping that in my brain to protect my own child and to protect transracial adoptees, right?
Mhm.
And even just other people of color, right?
Mhm.
To make sure that if we're in a situation and somebody says something, even if they're saying it as a term of endearment, as a compliment, as a cute
Yeah.
nickname,
Mhm.
to help as strong allies in support. So that's
Mhm.
so to me, just reading through the book, those were the components that again, as the sponge I am trying to be to continue to learn and improve upon on my education around how to be a good ally. That's what I gleaned of how to hear these things that are upsetting, that could be, microaggressions or or just aggressions, and
Right.
and how to
Yeah.
how to stop them in my little sphere of a world.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
think
I
that's
think for me, that was a big thing that I learned too. I mean, we already know that adoption language is super important to know what terms to use when you're discussing adoption with people inside and outside of the triad. And I think that it is especially important in these transracial um, subjects and raising a transracial child. And I really liked that her mom, I can't remember the exact story in the book, but they were grocery shopping together, and like the person that was at the register like asked the mom a question about her. She's standing right there and the mom was like, "Why don't you ask her?"
yeah.
Or responding to people that say things that are microaggressions that they don't see the problem with that, like, "Oh, why would you use that term? Like, what was, what made you think about that?" Or I don't know, just like calling them out, and then also letting your child know that, like, it's okay to not be okay with that. And let's have a conversation about it and why that makes you feel the way that it made you feel. And so just being really cognizant of the words that we use. Um, and I know that we all make mistakes and we all have these little things that we didn't even realize were there. But I think that I love your term of always being a learner and being a listener first, Allison. And so I think that that's how we're going to grow. That's how we're going to better address these situations. And I know at the heart of it, we always want what's best for the adoptee. And so I think we really have to focus too. And I think it's especially important in transracial adoptions because she talks about white privilege by osmosis, like growing up in a white
Ugh,
family. She didn't
yes.
realize that things were easier for her than they would have been had she been raised by her
Mhm.
biological family. And so I think that having our adoptee at the forefront of our mind and their best well-being, we have to remember, even if you have biological children, you have to remember you're not just raising kids, like you're raising adults. And so what's the best way to equip them as an adult? And for a transracial adoptee, it's not denying their skin color, and it's not making cutie little comments like, "Oh, my little Oreo," to make them feel
Right.
better about being different in a family. Like, you have to equip them for the real world that they're going to come in contact with when they go off to college, when they get that first job
For
interview,
sure.
when they make friends that are, in the culture or the race
Mhm.
of their biology. And so I think we just have to keep that at the forefront of our mind, constantly be learning and listening to these stories of adoptees, like you said, Allison.
I think that's so when you were I love the white by osmosis like idea and that title of that because when she's talking to those teenage boys, they continue the conversation about this just continuing about like the things that their parents don't seem to be aware of as these young black men are growing up,
Mm,
right? And he's talking about this particular young man's talking about he's like my other friends are having the talk with their parents and they're like, my parents don't even know that I need to talk. And the talk he's referring to is as a black man, his white parents have no idea what it's like to be a black man and what that
mhm,
means. And he said, everything changed when I hit 5'8", like 5'8". He
mm,
said all the old white ladies at church would clutch their purses when they were around them when he was by himself. He said, but when I'm in the vicinity of my parents' whiteness, it affords me the privileges of the white people. And I was like, oh my
mm,
gosh,
yeah.
like that is, and I don't think those parents necessarily did that on purpose. It's just, like you said, Allison, always learning, always being aware, being an ally for these kids of ours and the other adoptees. And that is just a very telling story. Um,
They didn't know. Those
yeah,
parents didn't have to get a race conversation when they were younger.
yes,
That's
Mhm,
didn't have to.
so again, it just goes back to the learning.
Yep.
And another piece I just want to mention because we're talking about learning and, protecting and stuff. I also want to talk about celebrating their heritage. And so
yeah.
learning from, their racial mirrors, how best we can help them celebrate and surround them with the right, racial mirrors, other folks like within their culture going to different things like learning different, if
Yep.
it's different foods that can be made, if it's, hey, there's like different cultural dances and celebrations, and other, folks that actually are surrounded by their own culture learn this when they're young. They should learn it when they're young too. And so again, it's that whole being a sponge and trying to learn what's happening to try to help them again to grow up to be happy and content adults within their own skin.
Yep.
Yes, I love that you brought that up because there was another part in the book that really just like blew my mind about Ethiopia. So it's an international adoption and how they had trouble with their stomach and they visited
Yep.
their home country as an adult. And it says he learned that his body needed wheat, soybeans, mutton, and other foods that his ancestors had eaten for generations. He continued that diet after returning to America, and his digestive issues have not returned. And I think that that could be a little bit of just like being able to reconnect, maybe some sort of like even like tension that you hold in your own body of being an adoptee, that like trauma that you can hold on to that can cause issues like that. But then I think there's also something to eating those cultural foods, eating those things that your ancestors ate, and where you are geographically from. And so I think I love that you said that, Allison, because I think that parents need to continue those traditions, and even if it comes down to cooking a meal like you said, or playing the music within their home, I think that is super super important and can be so impactful in the growth and long-term health of an adoptee.
I agree. Love that. I want to talk about the term ghost kingdom, because that was used in here, and I know I've heard it this term defined before and the concept of it, but I guess I personally never heard it called the ghost kingdom. It's just kind of. But let's talk about that. I want Allison to talk about what the ghost kingdom is, and then we'll go from there. Start this conversation. What this is.
Sure. So while I have known about it my whole life, I've only learned about the actual term within the last few years. It is especially it's especially a big deal for folks that came from closed adoptions, but it is still a thing for folks from open adoption, right? Because there are still elements you don't know. You may not know every family member. You may not know them as deeply as you could. So for me, coming from a closed adoption, it was dreaming up and fantasizing and filling in the gaps, quote unquote, because I had very little information about my history, my parents, my extended family. And for me, my mom had a semi-famous friend. I'll use the word semi a little loosely. She was a country singer that would, she actually did perform and have concerts. But so semi-famous, right? Nobody would actually know her name. I fully made up in my head because she was the only person that I ever saw in my life that looked like me. She had blonde hair and brown eyes, just like I did. And so I thought, because she used to be a roommate of my mom's, that she must have gotten pregnant, and then that's how this happened, and this is how my mom, and I would say it to my mom, and she would tell me, that's not it, she would correct me, but it did not matter. It did not matter because I needed to solve this problem in my head of not knowing where I came from, right? And then at different points, you think different things, right? So like when I got older, I knew that was not the case. But then you fill in other things. So from the adoptee standpoint, the ghost kingdom is a way to fill in the gaps that weren't filled in, and also to make it a story that's acceptable in your own heart. Because things that are very, very difficult for young children to understand are struggles, right? I always say it's tough to explain to a child that two different people have jobs, and one person's job can cover their bills and can afford them a house, like a place to live, and other people's, it might not, right? And that's it's too much for a child to understand. So they need to fill in the gaps with things they understand, and they understand fairy tales, fantasies, etc. And I will even say, I don't know, I might even subconsciously have some now still, right?
Yeah.
Uh, like thinking that my birth father is happy and content not knowing that I exist and that I don't wanna bother him, and that might not be the truth at all.
Right.
He might know about me or he might not know about me, and as soon as he learns, he might wanna
Yep.
know about so I wanna
Right.
I just wanted this to be open enough to show that this could be, affecting children as they become adults, as they become
Yeah.
teens. Also for open adoption, they might fill in the gaps with some other stuff.
Yeah.
They could be filling in the gaps, around extended family. They could be filling in gaps around the why that they might just not know.
Mhm.
So a ghost kingdom to me, could mean a lot of things in there. And the only issue to me is when it's kind of, as you guys were saying, like when the fantasy goes too far and then reality is
Mhm.
disappointment.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
so it is balancing that. Like I said, like my mom constantly corrected me, like, "It's not, honey, like we know that, this information about your birth mom, that's not my friend, that was the country singer," you know,
Mhm.
um, but it is a tough thing for adoptive parents to number 1, a lot of adoptees don't even tell the adoptive parents that we have a ghost kingdom. It just happens in our head.
Yeah.
Sure.
But most adoptees, if you get us together,
Yeah.
we can talk about it with each other and be like,
Wow.
"Well, I
Yeah.
thought, when I, saw this astronaut, I thought that has to be my dad," or, whatever it
Mhm.
is, but it's usually like something
Mhm.
more fanciful than real life. But I did want to turn it to Jessie because she had mentioned that Ghost Kingdom is not just solely for adoptees. So I wanted
Yeah.
to turn it to her for the birth mom perspective.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, anytime there's separation, our mind is going to fill in the blanks like you were talking about to help us feel more grounded, in who we are and our identity. And so for birth mothers, I mean, I what's the word I'm looking for? I closed myself off to my ghost kingdom for quite a while.
Mm.
And the reason I did that was to protect myself. I didn't want to start fantasizing or getting into the what ifs or dwelling in that place because I didn't wanna be let down. I tried to
Yeah.
manage my expectations, but what I realized what I was doing was I was actually closing myself off to, intimacy with my daughter. And so I think that there has to be a healthy balance. Like we said, you can be so caught up in your ghost kingdom to where you have these really, really high expectations. And then when you're in reunion or when you get more information and you have more answers and they don't line up to your ghost kingdom,
Yeah.
you're going to experience major letdown and
Mm.
potential heartbreak. And so I think you need to be able to, think about the what ifs while having a realistic approach to it or realistic expectations.
Mhm.
Because, like I said, I didn't even want to think about what life would look like if I had chose to parent because that was too hard for me to sit with.
Yeah.
And I realized that was just denial. That was me just protecting myself and not wanting to feel all the feels and all that kind of
Sure.
stuff. But as my daughter got older, I started to realize I need to start thinking about these things. I need to kind of envision what life could look like. And you kind of make up for the memories that you don't have.
Yeah.
Um, and so I just started getting used to, little, pretend outings or what activities I would like to do, little things like that. So the ghost kingdom doesn't always have to be about what your parents are, what they look like or what they're doing or why you were placed. It could be the little moments of like the things that you would like to do with your family,
Yeah.
like attending soccer games or going to the movies and little things like that. Those are the little things that help again create intimacy when you don't have physical closeness, but you do have to be very careful not to get lost in your ghost kingdom.
Mhm.
Just like a castle, there's different towers, and so you can kind
Yeah.
of think it's
Yes.
easier to compartmentalize things that way when you're in your ghost kingdom. So it only makes sense that young children and adoptees, adult adoptees and birth parents, and even adoptive parents,
Yeah.
especially if they don't have information about their child's birth family, they're going to kind of create scenarios in their head as well. So I think it can be
Mhm.
applied to anyone in the adoption constellation,
Yeah,
but it's mostly
absolutely.
used for adoptees.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You go ahead, Mel.
No, I was going to say, I think it's really good for adoptive parents to recognize that this happens, that you can't just
Yeah.
sweep stories under the rug and be like, well, it's fine. We don't need to talk about it because like Allison said, a lot of adoptees don't tell their adoptive parents about it. It's like this little secret. I guess that's why it's called a ghost kingdom that they have inside of them. And I feel like kind of like what you said too, Jesse, that there's probably that potential of even the adoptees that are like denying it, like, no, I'm fine. I don't need to know. I don't need, like, it's still there somewhere in the back of their mind, even if they're closed off, like you said, to your ghost kingdom, it still lives somewhere inside of you. And I loved um, in the chapter where she's talking about it, this little rhyme that
Yes.
she put in. It says, as I
Love
was
it.
walking up the stair, I met a man who was not there. He was not there again today. Oh, how I wish he'd go away. Like,
Yeah.
that's just wow to think, it's something that's not there and you're denying that it's there. And then you're like, just go away. Like
Mm-hmm.
But
it's
he's not even
there.
there.
It's
But he's not there.
undeniably that it
Yes.
is there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Correct. No,
Yeah.
and to bring it back to the book too, to talk about the author's perspective of the Ghost Kingdom, she even said like so she fantasized that Magic Johnson was her dad and that Brandy was her mom. Although she knew likely that wasn't true, she kind of
Right.
let herself go into that place. And then
Mhm.
she said, but in reality, she really did like envision her birth mom having like this huge megawatt smile like she did, and the what she like envisioned she'd look like, tall like she was, all of that. But then to go what you're saying to Jesse of like you and Allison, like you got to be careful of that, because then when she did reunite with her birth mother, there was so much rejection and hurt that she
Mm-hmm.
experienced because it was nothing like her ghost kingdom. And
Right.
not
Right.
that she thought it was going to be exactly like, but I think, there was that like I don't know, that desire where she thought there would be that something that resembled her, or something that felt like her, or that magnetic draw that she was hoping. And I think that is just good to know that. I mean, as if there's adoptees listening, or birth moms, or even adoptive parents, like you're saying, to know that your kids are going to struggle with that. But my question is if for adoptive parents who their children, don't have never talked about this, but now they're hearing this and they're wondering, okay, my child has this ghost kingdom, but they've never told me about it. Is that something you would encourage to like bring up in conversation, or like open a door so they can, or is that something you feel like is okay for them to keep to themselves? I'm just curious what we feel like that is there, as far as to, have the vulnerability and allow for that conversation, or is that personal? I don't know. That's a question.
That's an excellent question. So I am a big proponent of talking all things adoption with
Yeah.
your child. The more you can have little conversations, not even like big ones with
Yeah,
like the
big
big
sit down
topics,
ones. Yeah.
big sit down, just like
Mhm.
little conversations. You're down on the ground and they're playing. You could say, have you ever imagined what your birth family would be like? Or especially if I know that most adoptions now are open, but like, do you ever think about them? Have you ever, fantasized things being different or anything like that? Like that's all it could be. And then it might just be like, well, yeah, I'm a princess and she's the queen.
Yeah.
And then they move on to something else. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like these conversations, it's just one thing I always want to tell adoptive parents, because they feel a lot of pressure to have like the right
Yeah.
conversations.
Right.
Have lots of
Yes.
little ones, and I just want to be real clear, I'm an adoptee and I flub it up all the time. So
Yeah.
so just try. But yeah, I think go ahead. Just go ahead and ask them. They might not even know if they've had these yet. And they might
Sure.
not necessarily do all adoptees always have them.
Right.
And they could be so small they might not even recognize it.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's interesting. Whenever there are unknowns, as Jesse was saying, we all want to fill in the blank, right? Like,
Mhm.
we do it with politics. Well, they must, want that bill because of this and that. We don't know why
Right.
they want that bill.
Right.
It's like we're
Imagination,
always
yeah.
trying to like fill in the
Yeah.
gaps with
Yes.
things.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it's perfectly fine to say, like, hey, have you ever thought about that? Do you know?
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, do you ever
Mhm.
fantasize? And they might just say no in the end of that conversation. But remember, you brought up a conversation about adoption.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's true.
the unknown makes us uncomfortable. And
Yep.
she even says in the book, my mom understood the inevitability of human nature,
Yeah.
that when faced with the
Love
absence
that.
of facts, we create stories out of thin air.
Yeah.
And so whether you have the information or not to provide your child, like you were saying, you can ask them questions. You can even say little things like, "Oh, I saw this flower and it reminded me of your mom," or little
Mhm.
things, but letting your
Mhm.
child know that you are thinking of their adopt or their birth family tells them that it's
Mhm.
okay for them to be thinking of their birth family.
Mhm.
So it doesn't even have to be a conversation. It doesn't even have to be questions. It can just be like the little
Mhm.
things of like,
Mhm.
I bet your mom loved tacos. I mean,
Right.
little
Something for
Right.
silly
sure.
things like
Yeah.
that. Because
Yeah.
you don't know, you don't have to have all the answers, but there are ways that you could facilitate those conversations and encourage healthy curiosity in a way that is, vulnerable and transparent and healthy
Yeah.
without
And
letting them kind of trail off on their own. Because
Yeah.
right.
ultimately, like we're supposed to be students of our children, whether we're parenting or whether we're adopting or place or whatever it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we have to coach them through that because one day they will be adults and they will have to make decisions of their own. And so are
Mhm.
you doing things to make that transition harder for them or are you doing things to make that transition easier for them?
Yeah. And Jesse, like, if I can be so bold, because now having this conversation is like stirring these questions inside of me. But like, as a birth mom that is parenting other children, like, do you think about the fact that maybe your kids have a ghost kingdom of what it would be like to know their sibling better?
Oh
Or,
yeah, I mean
um,
my oldest son he's 6 and I would be shocked at the things that come out of his mouth about adoption. I mean, I work from home. I talk about adoption a lot, so they hear it a lot. But yeah, they'll play imaginary games with their half sister. They'll like pretend she's in the room, and they've made
mm,
comments about, "Oh, I wish that we could live with her," things like that. And it's sad, but you also have to realize that he's not saying it from a place of painful longing, really,
mhm,
because it is just what it is, at least not yet.
mhm,
I'm sure he'll have mixed emotions when he gets older that I'll have to handle when we get there.
Mhm.
But he just, has this idea of who his half sister is and just wants to know her, is just
yeah,
curious about her. And I don't blame him. But he's 6 years old and he's having these conversations with me.
yeah,
I won't
Yeah.
share, a lot of some of the things that he's talked about, but I mean, he has said some like extremely profound things that if I typed it out, people would probably not believe me.
Mhm.
But speaking of kids, I mean, there's a part in the beginning of the book where her mom encourages her to journal her feelings. And I did the math, and she was probably about 9 years old when she wrote this. And she says, "People always tell me I'm so lucky. Is that because no one else wanted me? Did I win the lottery of parents?" And this is an 8 or 9 year old child. And so
mhm,
don't underestimate children, adopted
mhm,
Mhm.
children, and what they're
mhm,
thinking. So even if your child hasn't expressed it, "Oh, they're 7, they're 8, they can't possibly be thinking about these things." They absolutely are thinking about these things, and they've probably been thinking about these things for longer than you think they have been thinking
Mhm.
about these things.
yes, yes. Hi, podcast fam. That is all for this week's episode of the Funding Love podcast in our discussion of You Should Be Grateful by Angela Tucker. We decided to split this one into 2 weeks of content, so be sure to tune back in next week for the rest of our conversation. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Funding Love podcast. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Funding Love podcast. We are a crowd-funded nonprofit, which means that people like you can help make a lasting impact in the lives of adoptive families and birth moms. At Funding Love, we create post-adoption experiences that strengthen bonds, build community, and restore people. And when you partner with us, whether that is giving online, signing up to become a monthly donor, or simply buying merchandise from our shop, you are funding love.